Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity of the Westminster Foundation to make a contribution to this event. Of the three representatives of the Westminster Foundation, we constitute a pretty unusual body of representatives. We had a Scottish nationalist who wants Scotland to become independent from the Westminster Parliament to a large extent. We had a moderate Irish nationalist who wants Irish unity in the long run. And now you have me, who's a citizen of the Irish Republic, which left, I suppose, the UK back in 1922. So we're a very strange collection of people to be representing this particular organisation. Now, my presentation is going to be very different from John's. I don't have any statistics. I'm not talking about an electoral system. Largely, I'm going to talk about the concept, which is the concept of consensus, and look at how this particular concept might mean something in the context of a constitutional transition. Now, a lot of the concepts we associate with democracy, including democracy itself, such as freedom, liberty, limited government, constitutionalism, and so forth, legitimacy, they're very ropey concepts. They kind of float in the air. And the real question for democratic transitions is how do you devise institutions that make them less floating concepts, but anchored in concrete institutional practices. And I think the importance of consensus in the Tunisian context is really this: how do you devise a constitution that anchors the political system in a culture of consensus? Now, to look at examples of how this has happened in the past, I don't think it's very useful to look at long-established democracies, but we can look at particular examples, maybe in the last 30 years, of democratic transitions, where we could say that the basic purpose of the transition was actually to engineer this consensus. We could see, for example, the case of Spain in the late 1970s, where representatives of an authoritarian regime, which emerged out of the Civil War experience, negotiated a new constitution with a view to national reconciliation with a variety of parties, nationalist and socialist, that wanted a democratic system. The pact, or the deal, was that the old regime would not suffer revenge and that the new challengers would nonetheless achieve a democratic transition. Another example would be the case of Poland in the 1990s, where representatives of the former communist regime and the new challengers with the Catholic Church entered into roundtable negotiations, and a roundtable was constructed very much like the tables you have in front of you, to imply that there was no hierarchy in terms of the participants in these talks. Another very well-known example is, of course, that of South Africa, where Nelson Mandela entered into negotiations with the representatives of a racist and discriminatory apartheid regime, making the case that the democratic future of South Africa would be determined by the majority. Now, because this threatened the future of the minority, the constitutional deal was that they would enter into negotiations and come up with a set of basic principles in advance of drafting the constitution, and then leave it to the Constitutional Court to decide whether the final document was in accordance with that set of principles. And that largely worked. We also have the example very recently of Turkey, where for the first time in its history, a civilian constitution is being drafted by 4 parties on a parliamentary commission on an equal basis. Now, these seem to me all good examples of how an element of consensus was introduced into the constitution-making process. Now, what would we say about them in a comparative sense? The 3 that resulted in constitutions, excluding Turkey, all have the basic characteristic of elite consensus being a necessary first step to a societal consensus. Secondly, in these 3 cases, it's pretty clear that the institutions that were agreed outlived the elites that designed them. Thirdly, in all these cases, after about 3 or 4 years, consensus was no longer the modus operandi, and the political systems moved into a more competitive type of politics. And lastly, and I think this is very relevant to Tunisia, in South Africa, not so much in Poland, certainly in Spain, and potentially in Turkey, you could argue that a common identity, a consensus on what national identity signifies, which many people in Tunisia think is lacking, you could argue that this was actually a product of the constitution drafting process. So in that sense, a consensus about national identity was not an inherited condition, but actually a conscious construction by political actors. Now, in terms of my knowledge of Tunisia, it's very, very limited. Obviously, when you're entering on a new departure for the first time in your history, some would say for the first time in the history of the Arab world, there is a lot of uncertainty, and this necessarily leads to a lack of self-confidence, anxiety, and so forth. But consider this particular case. There is a distinction in political science between systems that give expression to the majority rule principle and those that are based on consensus. And nowadays in political science, it's generally agreed that a number of small European democracies are very consensual. And one of them is Finland, very developed, very egalitarian, very progressive, of a consensual democracy. But how can we know in advance whether a consensual process will produce such an outcome? In the case of Finland, when it became independent after the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917, it became independent on the 6th of December 1917. And within 6 weeks, there was a brutal civil war, after which between 35 and 37,000 people lost their lives. That was the beginning of Finnish democracy. They responded to this particular crisis by adopting a consensual constitution, creating a strong president who played a role in mediating between the parties, and in time the two sides to the civil war became reconciled. So if you're worried about the starting point of Tunisia on its particular road to democracy, you just have to look back in history to realise we cannot predict success or failure in advance.